Okay, well, bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Dajaha. Thank you for joining our webinar today, where we will be speaking with Paul Jenkins and Mark Kruger about the prospects for the CPTPP, i.e. the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and whether this trade agreement can actually serve as a catalyst for a reinvigorated international trading system. And we also want to take a look at the role that Canada might be able to play in that regard during its chairmanship year. My name is Philippe Rheault. I'm the director of the China Institute here at the University of Alberta. And before we get started, allow me to do a little bit of housekeeping and also share a few remarks to help set the stage. Firstly, I would like to note that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. I'd also like to share a quick word with our viewers about the China Institute. The China Institute is the largest think tank and policy institute dedicated to the study of China in Canada. It's independent, thanks to a significant and visionary endowment about 15 years ago that flowing from Edmonton's McTaggart family, and their donation of an extraordinary collection of Chinese imperial art and textiles. This donation was then matched by the Alberta government. The China Institute's mandate basically is to help deepen understanding of China and also try to chart some new paths for enlightened engagement with China. We also want to examine global issues where a more productive engagement with China will also be accretive to the global commons. And so from that perspective, certainly the topic today certainly fits nicely into our mandate. Our talk today should run for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to try to add another 15 to 20 minutes at the end for questions and answers. And so I'd like to encourage the audience to submit questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. This event is also being recorded, so that folks who can't make it today will have an opportunity to watch the event via our website in the future. Maybe to try to set the scene very briefly, I'll offer a few remarks and then pass it on to Mark for his presentation. I think many of the viewers know the CPTPP is an ambitious trade agreement whose genesis was basically as the TPP under the Obama administration. This was a function of a desire, on the one hand, by the U.S. to put forward a more modern, comprehensive, and enforceable agreement that could address new issues related to labor, to the environment, intellectual property, commerce, et cetera, issues that perhaps weren't properly covered under WTO architecture. But it was also, I think it's fair to say, part of the Obama administration's putative pivot to Asia at the time, and an attempt to counterbalance the China's rising geoeconomic influence in the region there. Although this effort, after many years of hard work, then got derailed very quickly in the early days of the Trump administration, after some travails, the TPP was resuscitated as the CPTPP, which basically has 11 members, but not the United States. And probably soon to be 12, with the UK probably joining soon. One of the ironies, of course, is that the US is not part of the agreement, but it's kind of, in large part, thanks to the allure of access to the US market that many of the countries actually were interested in joining in the first place, most notably Japan. You know, as an anecdote, perhaps I can share very quickly, I was actually quite involved in the talks that led to the resuscitation of TPP as CPTPP. I'll have to admit as well, it's the Canadians are the ones responsible for the addition of 2 more vowels to that moniker, and I have to say, traveling around the world, it actually causes many people to stumble. But nevertheless, you know, from a Canadian perspective, for example, our trade policy folks in the Canadian government had been trying to convince Japan to engage in bilateral FTA talks with Canada for many years, but Japan was not particularly interested because the compromises it would need to make domestically, especially in areas of agriculture and others, weren't worth it politically for access to the Canadian market. But they, with the allure of access to the U.S. market, they did all the heavy lifting that led to the TPP agreement that Canada has joined. And now we're in a situation, for example, where Canada is part of this CPTPP. We have access to the Japanese market, and yet the Americans don't. So you can see how, you know, from many perspectives, I think it's certainly an interesting move on the part of the U.S. to take a step back from that agreement. It's a very modern agreement. Like I mentioned earlier, there are provisions on labor, environment, e-commerce, investment, state-owned enterprises, and government procurement that actually raise standards and force more openness and access. Its enforceability mechanisms are also ambitious, although maybe the panel can help enlighten me as to whether they actually work in practice. My sense is they appear stronger, but they're largely untested at this point. And I guess as I prepare to pass the baton over to Mark, some things that come to mind to me are questions such as, is this kind of CPTPP model the model we want to look at going forward as we deal with the kind of WTO stasis that we're experiencing today? Can the CPTPP help right the course for international trade? Is it an instrument that, if it was enlarged and with more membership, be able to push back against the prevailing trends of fragmentation and protectionism, and move everyone back towards integration of common rules and enhanced economic growth globally? And of course, you know, given that we are the China Institute, we take a look at the China dimension of that as well. I think, you know, given the level of ambition that's embedded in this trade agreement, is there a place for China at the table? Are they capable of living up to those standards? What about Taiwan? Another question. And perhaps before I pass it on to Mark, I'll add that our institute is actually doing some work right now in terms of examining from an economic modeling perspective, what a China membership in TPP would mean for Canada in terms of economic impacts. And that's something that's in the works. So stay tuned and keep an eye open for that in the coming weeks. So anyway, I'll stop there. I've already said enough, but to perhaps examine some of those questions and many more, I'd like to turn to Mark and Paul, and first turn to Mark. Mark is a fellow here at the China Institute. He's based in Shanghai. He's also a fellow at the Yicai Research Institute and also at CG as well. So well involved in many think tanks and doing a lot of thinking about China. Between 2020 and 2023, Mark was the opinion editor at Yicai Global in Shanghai. And previously, he held a 30-year career with the Bank of Canada, in the course of which he served as senior advisor to the Canadian Executive Director at the IMF and as the head of the economic and financial section of the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. During his years in Beijing, I was also in China, but mostly in Chongqing. And so we've had a chance to work together, but mostly from afar. So it's great to have him back again. And perhaps, Mark, since you're here with me at the Institute, although we're on different screens, allow me to offer you a warm welcome to Edmonton and pass it over to you.
Thanks, Philippe. It's great to be here. Let me take a moment and share my screen. So I'd like to present the concepts that Paul Jenkins and I have been working on in a paper that we published through CD Howe. And it really has to do with the CPTPP as a mechanism to end global fragmentation. So to go quickly through our thesis, you know, as you all know, the global economy has become quite fragmented. And we think one of the problems here is that international institutions have been unable to adapt to the changing realities of the global economy. And we think that we see the research that tells us that global integration is highly correlated with rapid economic growth, and global institutions have a large role to play. And so our thesis is that the international community should recommit to a common set of rules that will help global growth. So this is a graphic that we stole from the folks at the IMF, and it shows trade openness over 150 years from 1870 to 2021. And trade openness here is defined as the sum of imports plus exports as a percent of GDP. And you can see that this is certainly not a steady picture, that it's a cyclical picture. And if we go back to the first wave of industrialization, that wave was caused by technical change. So we saw improvements in transportation, such as the development of steamships and railways and canals, and also the invention of the telegraph, making transcontinental communication possible. And as you can see in this period, global trade increased, and that increase was abetted by common rules. So, for example, over this period, most countries are on the gold standard, and that made for some stable exchange rates, and it promoted international trade. Also, countries had similar customs procedures and trade regulations. So this is the first wave of globalization. You can see that trade openness increased sort of monotonically through the period. Then we come to the interwar era, and during the war and between the wars, the global trading system broke down. There was a new emphasis on protectionism as the Great Depression hit, and countries put up high tariff walls, and they devalued their currencies, the so-called beggar thy neighbor economic policy. And as you can see, trade openness fell to levels that were even lower than the 1870s. After the war, policymakers were cognizant of the benefits of common rules, and they set up the Bretton Woods institutions, in particular the World Bank, the IMF, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And again, we saw during this period an increase in trade openness. Going to between the 20s and the 1980s and 2008, another series of rapid globalization. China joined the WTO in 2001. And what pushed this phase of globalization was, again, technical change. We had advances in telecommunications and in transportation that really brought the world together. And again, with China joining the WTO in 2001, most of the world's trade was covered by common rules. More recently, we've seen a plateauing in trade openness. This is following the global financial crisis, when a lot of second thoughts about financial liberalization occurred. Also, the pandemic made the issue of security very, very close to the minds of policymakers. Brexit, for example, the UK deciding not to be part of the European experience anymore, is an example of this fragmentation, and security concerns have become foremost after the pandemic, and also the war in Ukraine. So, I've showed you examples of globalization based on trade, but we can look at broader measures of globalization. And KOF is a Swiss research institute, and they construct globalization indices that measure integration across a variety of domains: the economic, the social, and the political dimensions. The KOF's globalization indices are the most widely used in academic research. They cover 203 countries over the period, the 50-year period, 1970 to 2021. So one of the interesting features of KOF's indices is that they cover both trade and finance on both a de facto and de jure basis. So let me tell you what is de facto globalization. De facto globalizations measure actual economic outcomes, so flows and activities. This is similar to the graph that I presented to you earlier. The IMF data just looked at cross-border trading goods, but the KOF globalization indices look at cross-border trading goods and services, as well as trading partner diversity. With respect to international finance, the KOF globalization indices measure both stocks of international assets and liabilities and cross-border payments and receipts, so both international stocks and flows. Now, that was de facto globalization. De jure globalization, these indices try to capture the policies and conditions that foster those economic flows we just talked about. So these are policies and conditions. And so with respect to international trade, this would be the COF measures incomes from taxes on trade, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and the extent of trade agreements. With respect to international finance, COF measures capital account openness, investment restrictions, and international treaties with investment provisions. So it's the infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure. Let me show you now a picture of COF's trade globalization indices. I'm showing you three measures here. I'm showing you the de facto measure here in blue, and you can see that the de facto measure fell to a 25-year low in 2020 during the pandemic. Also, the de jure measure here, and you can see that that sort of plateaus at a high level. So this is again trade agreements and things like that, notwithstanding all the policy, all the tariffs that were part of the China-US trade war. This de jure measure stays at a fairly high level, and then COF calculates the sort of weighted average. It's just 50% of this one and 50% of that one. That's their composite here. So trade globalization, trade again. This is different from what the IMF showed because it includes services as well. Fell down to a very weak level, rebounded a bit in 2021, likely still rebounding. But the de jure measure staying at a high level. Turning to financial globalization, again, we have the de jure measure, which basically, it fell during the financial crisis. People were skeptical of financial liberalization. They didn't do much. So this de jure index has been sort of plateaued at a low level. Nevertheless, financial flows and stocks of international assets and liabilities are pretty well near record levels. So in terms of financial globalization, at least, the story is quite a good one. People are still lending and borrowing across borders. So now COF is very, very good at trying to tease out what is the relationship between globalization and economic growth. There should be some relationship, and because they're able to deconstruct globalization into many different types of indices on the economic side, both financial and trade, and then the de jure and de facto measures of both, we have many different ways that globalization could support growth. And they look at this relationship here. They say economic growth is some function of globalization and some function of other variables. Let me tell you what these, so what they're looking at here is economic growth. They're looking at per capita income growth over 5-year periods. Then they're going to put in here their different globalization indices. They have 9 control variables. We can look at those a little bit later. They also have a fixed country effect and a fixed time effect. And these are just dummy variables that are used to pick up any kind of significant trends in the data that would be missed by these other variables. And there's an error term. So we can look at the regression results, and we see that overall, the overall globalization index, so this is including trade and financial, both de jure and de facto. So this is positively associated with economic growth at the 1% level. The initial level of per capita income is also positive or negatively associated. And the idea here, this is convergence. The higher your per capita income, the more slowly you grow. And if you're sort of a poor country, you have the possibility of catching up on economic growth. That's why there's a minus sign here, and that's also significant. They also have the log of, so the human capital index does not come in significantly. The log of life expectancy is significant at 5%. So the longer lived, the better economic growth. The fertility rate doesn't come in. Investment, again, comes in at the 1% significance level. Government consumption, insignificant. Rule of law index, significant at 10%. The inflation rate, not significant. Terms of trade, not significant, and so on and so forth. So there's just a handful of variables that are significant at 1%, of which one is the globalization index. Now let's see what part of the globalization index really matters for economic growth. So here we're going to set another series of regression. Here are the trade measures. Here are the financial measures, and we can break those both into de facto and de jure. And we see that the de facto measures of globalization are insignificant, while the de jure are, for both the trade and the financial, are significant at 1%. So really it is the rules that matter more than the outcomes. And the idea here is that clear rules help form expectations, and that if you know that your market is contestable, you'll behave in that way. You'll behave with that in mind, even if the flows are not large. So the conclusion that the COF researchers come out with, that it's really the rules, the institutions that matter, that's consistent with other academic research. So for example, Roderick, Subramanian, and Treme is a good study that looks at the roles of institutions, geography, and trade in determining countries' relative income levels. And these researchers find that institutional quality trumps everything else, the most important factor for economic growth. So institutions are very important. Paul and I put a lot of stake in the potential for the CPTPP to act as an anchor for rules going forward. And I think Philippe gave a great introduction to how the CPTPP evolved from the TPP, and that it's WTO plus. It's more comprehensive rules on electronic commerce, intellectual property, the disciplines for state-owned enterprises. And we believe that broad-based accession to the CPTPP can strengthen global governance and help countries address common challenges. This is our thesis. So the CPTPP requires countries to substantially eliminate tariffs and other trade barriers. The countries have to make strong commitments to opening their markets and abide by strict rules on competition, government procurement, state-owned enterprises, and the protection of foreign companies. Countries also have to commit to operate within a predictable framework for digital trade flows. Now, as Philippe mentioned, the UK agreed to join the CPTPP in 2023, last year. I think that still has to be ratified by the Parliament, and they'll join 11 other countries in the trading bloc. As far as I know, a half dozen other countries have applied to join the CPTPP, with China's application having been the earliest received. So there's been some modeling done on the economic benefits from broad accession to the CPTPP. This was done by Peter Petrie and Michael Plummer over at the Peterson Institute. I've stolen this graphic for them, and let me just go through how they see the benefits. So first of all, as Philippe mentioned, the TPP originally had the US in it. The US left, and the value of that trade agreement went down because the US was no longer there. Now, these modelers estimate that if China was to join and replace the US, the value of the trade agreement would actually be higher than with the US in it. So this is there's a network effect going on here. The more countries that join, the greater benefits for your joining as well. So you can see here that even without the US, the CPTPP would have a greater economic benefit to the global economy than the TPP would have had. The modelers also look at the CPTPP plus 5 additional countries who are, I think, also applying to join: Indonesia, Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Thailand. So if we were to put those countries in, you can see the value of the agreement goes up. And if China was to join that enhanced agreement, what the researchers call CPTPP 16 plus China, more than $1 trillion added to the global economy. And if the US were to come in and join this agreement, you could imagine that the benefit would be many multiples of this $345 billion. You could imagine that the benefit for the global economy could arise to some $2 trillion. That's huge. So all kinds of good things would happen if everybody joined the CPTPP. As Philippe mentioned, there are some challenges. Now, the original TPP, as Philippe said, reflected concerns about China's commercial policies. So the CPTPP addresses subsidies for SOEs, weak intellectual property rights, and forced technology transfers. Now, that being said, industrial policy and SOEs will continue to play a much larger role in China than they do in Western economies. So the challenge for China here is that to demonstrate that a so-called socialist market economy can be consistent with fair trade. Now, if discussions began tomorrow for China's accession to the CPTPP, I think those discussions would go many, many years. Looking back, it took 15 years of negotiations before China joined the WTO in 2001. And that was 5 more years on average than all the other countries that joined after 1995. So intensive negotiations. And to accede to the WTO, China took far-reaching reforms to bring its economy in line with international standards. When China joined the WTO, there was a lot of concern about its products flooding global markets. And I think that's a concern that's certainly front and center today as well. So when China joined the WTO, it accepted certain constraints, certain concessions. And the first of these is that partners could impose tariffs or quotas if Chinese imports disrupted their domestic producers. So a disruptive amount of imports could be tariffed according to WTO rules. These are special concessions that China undertook in order to join. China's trading partners could also apply non-market economy status when calculating anti-dumping duties on Chinese imports. And there were long-lasting limits set on the growth of Chinese textile and apparel exports. So people thought at this time, 20 years ago, that the Chinese economy would just simply destroy the textile and clothing industry across the world, much in the same way that people today think that the the Chinese electric vehicle industry poses a threat. So these are, in some sense, old concerns. Now, a big question was, has China abided by the WTO's rules? Many people feel that China was not a good global citizen. It did not abide by the WTO's rules, but I feel that that does not really stand up to analysis. So I'm going to present to you here some data collected by Xiangjin Wei. Xiangjin Wei is a professor of economics at Columbia University. And these blue boxes here, they show the amount of complaints against China and the US over the period 2001 to 2021. So you can see that, and notwithstanding China sort of dominating a lot of international trade over this period, there were double as many complaints filed against the US as there were against China. So when a complaint is filed against you, and for example, if you lose that complaint, you're supposed to remedy your policies. If you don't remedy your policies, you'll often find a second filing on the same issue. So Xiangjin Wei went ahead and compiled the second filings, and you can see that of the 47 complaints against China, only 2 came back. Whereas of the 110 complaints against the US, 15 came back. So the US, at least by this measure, was a lot more remiss for not following WTO rules than China was. I also would like to point you to the analysis done by the European Parliamentary Research Service. So this is a think tank and research service under the European Parliament. So certainly, I think we can say that they're an even-handed party here. And they say in those instances where the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism ruled against it, China faithfully complied with WTO rulings in a timely way, in contrast with the at times considerably delayed or even refused compliance by other major WTO members, such as the EU and the USA. So this is the European Parliament Research Service talking, and they feel at least that China was a compliant member of the WTO. China and Taiwan, this is something that Philippe raised. Can China and Taiwan be in the same organization, in the same international organization? Yes, they can. So there are at least 4 instances in which China and Taiwan have found a modus vivendi: in the WTO, in APEC, in the Asian Development Bank, and in the Olympics. China and Taiwan have both found ways to coexist together. So I think if there's a will, there's a way here. So I've talked a lot about the benefits for China. How about for the US? The US doesn't seem to be wanting to join an international trade agreement. What's in it for them? So, well, first of all, economic value. The original estimate by Petrie and Plummer was that the TPP would have boosted US GDP by 0.5%. The CPTPP with China would provide a much larger benefit, maybe double, maybe 3 times as much for the US. So the bigger the network, the more benefits you get. So a large accession becomes more and more attractive to the US economy. The CPTPP also provides a multilateral framework with which the US can engage China on issues of concern. Rather than handling things bilaterally, there would be a dispute settlement mechanism just like the WTO and internationally agreed upon rules with which to engage China on issues of concern. And I think the third point here is that by joining this agreement, the US would enhance its soft power. So the US is coming across, globally as protectionist. It has a unilateral approach. And, this isn't just for China. If you think about it, the steel and aluminum tariffs that were put on during the Trump administration, these have been maintained during the Biden administration. And, this basically put tariffs on steel and aluminum from many countries because of national security constraints and national security concerns. Now, a WTO panel ruled against the US. They said these tariffs were not consistent with WTO rules. Nevertheless, for those countries that are not covered by side agreements, such as India and Brazil, their steel and aluminum faces large tariffs, as is China's. You also wonder about how the Japanese feel. Nippon Steel tried to go in and buy US steel. There seem to be some roadblocks there. So the US, again, coming across protectionist and unilateral, this reduces its soft power. I think the US could be seen as a much more cooperative partner if it was folded into the CPTPP. I just want to also show you a graph here of how the markets of different countries will grow over time. This is incremental GDP growth. I'm growing out China at 4.7% to 2035, the US at 2%, and India at 6.3%. So the China market here, you can see the China market is, by this forecast at least, the growth in the China market would be 3/4 more than the growth in the US market, and significantly higher than the growth in the Indian market. So, having access to this market, especially access in the service sector, this would be good for US companies. One of the big concerns is the so-called China shock. The China shock is that China is very competitive in certain industries and that there's a lot of US job losses, and that's very politically difficult for the US. So, I think that what we have to do is, the problem with trade liberalization is the benefits are spread widely, but are relatively small, and the losses are concentrated and are very expensive. So you lose your job, but I get a cheaper computer. So two researchers, one from the LSE and one from the Federal Reserve, attempt to sort of quantify the gains and losses to US households of China's accession to the WTO. And they find that the cheaper prices that arise from more imports from China, they increased US households' annual purchasing powers by $1,500. Now, $1,500, that's significant, but you might overlook it coming in at $125 a month or whatever. So they want to skip these researchers recognize that jobs were lost by China competition. So they try and scale the amount gained by US households for each job lost. And they found that per job lost, the purchasing power of US consumers rose by over $400,000 for each job lost. And each job lost, the average salary was only $40,000. So you can see households were much better off. They could have somehow compensated those displaced workers. However, there is no kind of mechanism to do that. But at least in the opinion of Jaravel and Sanger, the gain to consumers was many multiples as big as the loss to those who have lost their jobs. So it's just important to remember the gains are not often well perceived, but they're real. They're real. So turning to Canada, as chair of the CPTPP Commission this year, we believe that Canada can help reverse the fragmentation of today's global trading system. It can help move the global economy back to a more open, rules-based trading system. And an important goal for China's chairmanship would be to clarify the rules of accession. Which countries are they going to look at first, and which countries are they going to look at second? That would be a big step forward in sustaining the expansion of the CPTPP. So, Paul and I are presenting a vision here of everybody abiding by global rules. It's if we had to predict, you may not predict that this was the most likely outcome, but we're trying to provide policy advice. We're trying to provide policy advice which we think will be the best for the global community. We're not trying to be naive. We're trying to provide what we think is good policy advice. And we're heartened that Raghu Rajan, who was formerly the chief economist at the IMF and also the governor of the Central Bank of India, he's a professor at Chicago, he says something similar in an op-ed a couple months ago in the Financial Times. Raghu Rajan says, we need a dialogue, perhaps starting with the US or China, or initiated by more neutral countries, on how the global system of trade and investment can accommodate geopolitical rivals, subsidies, and new information-intensive products without breaking down. This will require new rules of the game, more data, and possibly new independent institutions. So we feel that we have a very good independent institution, that's the CPTPP, and that will be a great place to start. So I'll stop here, and happy to discuss with you. Stop sharing.
Well, Mark, that's a great presentation, and thank you for that tour d'horizon. Clearly, I think we all agree that globalization, better market rules. Well, maybe not everyone agrees, but certainly it's important to make the case that a strengthened international trade system does lead to both de jure and de facto prosperity for all, and especially for developing countries that have an inordinate impact in terms of benefiting from that type of outcomes. And of course, Canada is also very dependent on international trade. So we have a big stake in making sure that the global system perdures and improves. So that's all wonderful. Maybe I'll stop there and move on to Paul to see whether he has any additional thoughts he might want to add. Paul, maybe a just quick reading of your short version of your bio, because the long one would be far too laudatory and also would take up too much time. So Paul, you received your master's in science and economics from LSE, and also political science. No, so it's London School of Economics and Political Science, right? The long form name in England. And you also have your BA in economics from the University of Western Ontario in London, Canada. From 2003 to 2010, Paul served as the senior deputy governor at the Bank of Canada and was the bank's chief operating officer and a member of its board of directors. His duties include overseeing strategic planning, the conduct of monetary policy, and as a member of the bank's governing council and participating in fulfilling the bank's responsibilities. So a mandate for fulfilling the bank's responsibilities with respect to financial stability. In addition to your current position as a senior fellow at C.D. Howe Institute, Paul, you're also the past chair of the Board of Governors of the University of Western Ontario and a member of the Ottawa Community Foundation Investment Community. So maybe over to you. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Philippe. And thank you, everyone, for the invitation to participate today. I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to provide some additional background or context, if you like, in terms of the motivation Mark and I had in writing this paper. And I'll echo to some degree some of what Mark has already covered. But there were three key factors that shaped our thinking. One, the need for the West to begin to think differently, given the realities of the economic shift away from the West to Asia and to the so-called global South more generally. Secondly, as Mark presented research supporting the view that it is the building of institutions that is most critical in supporting an open, competitive global trading system. And third, Canada needs to get back into what I call the pro-growth game, and has an opportunity as 2024 chair of the CPTPP Commission to show leadership, as it did, in fact, at Bretton Woods in 1944, in promoting and supporting an open global trading system to the benefit of all. Now, the fragmentation of today's global system that Mark talked about has indeed been the result of both economic and geopolitical factors. On the economic side, we've had the global financial crisis, Brexit, populist protectionism, COVID-19, and the digital revolution. And on the geopolitical side, security concerns have become more important, trumping economic issues in the eyes of many. This has led to multiple sanctions, along with export and investment controls being imposed. And put differently, economics is increasingly seen as a central battleground in geopolitical competition, so-called economic statecraft. And reflective of all this are the rising aspirations of the developing world and the associated contest between democracy and autocracy. But effectively, what we're seeing is a new world order unfolding. And the most critical issue in addressing this fragmentation is the relationship between the United States and China. As we quote in our paper, Treasury Secretary Yellen has stated that the relationship between the United States and China is one of the most consequential of our time, and that it is possible to achieve an economic relationship that is mutually beneficial in the long run, one that supports growth and innovation on both sides. This means that the United States would need to accommodate China's legitimate efforts to sustain a rising standard of living for its citizens, while deterring illegitimate ones. And China, as the world's largest trading nation, has a clear interest in maintaining an open trading system. Yet for China, as Mark has already indicated, it would mean a clear and abiding commitment to an open, rules-based economic system for the global economy. And we believe that the economic incentives are there for this to happen, perhaps not right away, but they are there. And for China, the incentive is further progress in closing its internal income gap, which is substantial between urban and rural households, as well as in closing the income gap between itself and the developed world. And for the United States, the incentive is in preserving its strength as an open society and its historical vision of the world that has always considered the interests of others. At the same time, virtually all nations, regardless of regime or stage of development, are facing challenges, are facing the same types of challenges, financial instabilities, rising inequality, climate change, of course, AI, spread of infectious disease, and so on. And these vulnerabilities represent global risk that can only be tackled through collective action. In brief, the challenge in reimagining such a new world order is clearly geopolitical, but the task is to renew global governance with today's realities in sharp focus, which, coming back to our paper, includes institution building. So I'll stop there, and we can turn and open up the session to general discussion. Thank you.
Paul, thanks so much for helping to add that kind of like 30,000 foot view of things as well, and noting as well that sometimes it's not just the economic equations that play, but also the geopolitical considerations as well. So I'll remind the audience we have a couple questions here to get things going, and if anyone wants to add some more, you can click on the box in the chat, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and add some questions. So now maybe before there's a couple interesting questions here, but maybe to follow up, Paul, on your comments, maybe I can start with a couple of kind of broader questions and get either your or Mark's thoughts about that if possible. You know, the way I see it, I mean, this might be a sweeping statement, but we seem to be in an era where political considerations are trumping economic ones, or at least we're in a phase of international cycle where that's occurring, and this is occurring both domestically in the U.S. and China, and also internationally. If you look at the U.S., the interestingly named Inflation Reduction Act is clearly, at least in part, an industrial policy legislative initiative. There's increasing techno-nationalism. Just yesterday, I believe, the new tariffs on EVs were formalized. So there's a lot of kind of like a political lens that's being put on trade policy, if you will. And of course, in China, it's the same thing with even very recently coming out of some very big policy conventions in China, including the Economic Work Conference, et cetera, like a repeated reminder, not just to Chinese audiences, but also to the world, that from the Chinese perspective, security goes hand in hand with economic development, and that also kind of sends a clear message. So, if I could kind of summarize, Mark was mentioning in his presentation, the U.S. needs to accept a rising China, at least economically, but also China needs to show clear and abiding commitments to an open, rules-based global economic system. It seems that like today, we're not really in that space. It seems like there's a bit of a negative cycle or kind of a dialectic going on that's leading us in a different direction. So, at the broader level, I think, assuming we all agree that these are noble objectives, how do we break out of the current cycle and kind of like right the ship, if you will?
Well, let me have a first go at that. I mean, it's a tough question to find an immediate answer to. I think the perspective Mark and I are trying to bring to all of this is the importance of economic growth for all nations, and that all nations fundamentally have a desire to grow and prosper and to provide economic well-being for their citizens. If you look at China today, and Mark is certainly closer to this than I am, but they are in a bit of a dilemma in the sense that they grew very, very rapidly as a result of their international integration. And I'm a firm believer that countries cannot grow and prosper by being inward looking. But they have a series of structural adjustments ahead of them that they have to work their way through. And part of that structural adjustment has to be the promotion of domestic demand, that notwithstanding China's strength as a trading nation, they're not going to grow and prosper exclusively on the basis of an export market that they can develop. They've got to promote domestic demand. They've got to be part of the global economy in that context. And so I think the incentives are there for China to continue to participate in the global economy. And likewise, in the case of the United States, I think the economic incentives are there. We're going through a very difficult period where because of technology, these security issues are very much at the forefront. But we do believe that through institutions like the CPTPP, people can come together. I take some comfort in the fact that discussions are in fact taking place at particular intersections. With regard to AI, for example, some of the announcements that have come out recently between China and the US, and other areas where there's been more discussion and dialogue. And my sense is that there's quite a bit more going on in financial areas than you would necessarily see in the popular press. So what's the answer? I guess I'm a believer that fundamental economic growth is such an important factor that countries are going to continue to want to work towards promoting that growth. And one of the important ways of doing that is to continue to be part of the global economy. But Mark, why don't you jump in and offer your thoughts?
Well, let me be bold. I mean, if Philippe asks, how do we right the ship, and maybe what can Canada do to help right the ship? The answer is Monday morning, they announced that they're ready to discuss acceding to the CPTPP with China. They just start the discussions. Now, of course, that doesn't resolve the issues, but that sort of lights a fire under the process. How will that help? Once we understand that China is under discussion to join the CPTPP, this builds like a network effect or a snowball effect. Maybe Canada understands that, hey, these discussions are going to take years till we get everything sorted out. At the same time, they say, the second country in line, we're opening discussions with them as well. And they just try and, promote as rapid a rollout of this trade agreement as possible. With more and more countries joining the agreement, there's a network effect that builds up. And this sort of, for the US, that becomes this FOMO, the fear of missing out. Everybody is going to open their service industries. Everybody's going to have these rules. Philippe mentioned rules about security. And people are worried about security, but there are rules around security. The WTO has rules around what constitutes security and the limits that could be used for trade disruption, and the CPTPP does as well. So this gives us a framework. How do we right the ship? We just start the process. We just start ruling it out. We don't say we end the process that China joins tomorrow, but the discussions start tomorrow, right? And that just lights a fire under the process.
Okay, well, Mark, thanks for that, because I was thinking, what can Canada do? And I was thinking to myself, okay, well, we have some very competent trade policy folks. Maybe we can do some capacity building in the region, help some of the potential exceeding countries to kind of up their game and be. But you just went right for the big piece there, so that's great. And but I'm seeing several questions from the audience now. Maybe what I'll suggest is, there's 2 or 3 questions that fall still at the broader macro level. So let's stay at the high kind of global macro level for a couple more minutes, and then we can go to China, where there's actually some interesting questions as well. So here's an interesting follow-up question, which is regarding the agency of the global South, and the rising agency, if you will. I think. If we observe the last few years, one of the biggest challenges that, I think global South is one way of saying it. I would say third parties, if you will, because I think it includes everyone from Vietnam to Germany to Canada to Singapore to Indonesia, and that's that everyone's been trying to position themselves vis-a-vis the push and pull of this rising China-US rivalry, right? And sometimes the economic vectors, for example, would align with China, but the security ones align with the US. Sometimes it's vice versa. And so everyone's trying to find a way to come up with a new posture, right? And some are more eloquent than others and more agile than others in doing so. But it's not just a challenge. You can also see there's more opportunity now for these kind of third countries, because they're getting richer. They don't have to conform to some clear kind of Cold War typology anymore. It's much more fluid. And so I wonder whether, when you look at this from perhaps the lens of opportunity, do either of you have any thoughts in terms of whether there's opportunities for some of these kind of middle countries to work together pragmatically to come up with their own agenda for globalization and perhaps kind of like push for a reiterated CPTPP, or indeed more broadly play a more constructive role in WTO, et cetera, And when I think of a broader coalition, it doesn't these countries don't necessarily need to be ideologically aligned, but they can be kind of interest-based alignments or coalitions. It just seems to me there's all of a sudden there's room for this to be occurring. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Mark, do you want to kick off on this one?
Well, I mean, we want to move away. We want to move away from a system where countries are being asked to choose sides, and we would rather have a system where countries are all falling under one umbrella. And when you think of small countries like Canada, or like Vietnam. I think it feels very well protected being part of the CPTPP. It knows its trading partners are going to operate under these rules. And we think that small countries they will definitely lose out in a sort of law of the jungle type of situation. And it's the small and medium countries that are well protected under clear rules. So again, we think that rather than choosing sides, we would like to see everybody get under the same umbrella. And the CPTPP has showed itself to be quite flexible. When you look at the existing members from Australia to Mexico to Vietnam, they're quite a different group of countries. They're not very similar. It's not as if they're all rich countries or they're all European countries or whatever. Right? It's a mixed bag. And so we think that the best way to avoid this kind of law of the jungle, which tramples on the weakest countries, is to have common rules and everybody to accede to those common rules.
And geographically, these countries are very diverse, to Mark's point. But I mean that's the essence of our paper, that we do see the CPTPP as a vehicle to bring countries together and move us back towards a system where we're all operating under a common set of rules. I think the global South, Philippe, that you're talking about, it's such a diverse grouping of countries that the common umbrella that Mark is referring to, I think, does offer a vehicle for these countries to become a force amongst themselves, but also within the community that is promoting global economic growth and integration more generally.
Okay, that's a great point. So one last question on the macro level here, and then we can move to the growing list of China-specific questions from our viewers. So if we up the pace of expansion of the CPTPP, does that create a risk of a de facto watering down of the quality of the agreement to a lower common denominator as members struggle to comply and adhere? What if some really can't walk the talk early on as we kind of up this pace a bit? I guess like this is me adding an additional comment, a bit like what the debate with the EU expansion over the last few decades, where if you move too quickly, you end up with members that may not share the political culture or the same level of commitment as the early members. So is that a risk, or is that something we should not worry too much about? Mm-hmm.
In my view, it's not a risk because there are dispute settlement procedures, right? So if a country came in and all of a sudden they're not abiding by the rules, there are ways to deal with that, right?
Yeah, that's a good answer. Maybe as a quick follow-up, that's actually part of the question as well. How confident are the two of you that the CPTPP's enforcement mechanisms are robust enough to handle, let's say, members that perhaps may down the road not completely be in good faith?
So I think there's only been one case that has come to the dispute settlement procedure of the CPTPP, and that's Canada and New Zealand over milk access.
There's a theoretical.
My understanding of the ruling, and I'm not an expert here, was some sort of split decision that the panel gave something to Canada and something to New Zealand. But I think that Canada was asked to provide more milk quota to New Zealand. So I mean, only been one case. Looks like it was an even balanced decision. Again, I'm no expert, but there's a procedure. As I mentioned,
that was a dispute between kind of poster childs of countries that are committed to the international trade regimes, rules-based international order, etc. But maybe it's a tough question to answer given the lack of data. But how confident are the two of you that the mechanisms in place are robust enough to handle future actions that might not be completely in the spirit of the commitments that were made?
Well, of course, if we don't move forward in terms of membership and agreements, we'll never know, and so there's always risks. But I don't think that's a risk that I would consider to be sufficiently large to restrict the importance of countries like Canada as chair to move the system forward. There will always be elements of concern, but that's the sort of risk that to me can and will be managed effectively.
Okay, that's great. So in the interest of time, there's like tons of questions about China now. I think we can
Well, that's
take
great.
certainly another 15 minutes or so,
Yeah,
but maybe we go with some yeah, not quick hits, but I may be a little bit more peremptory than I normally am in terms of trying to keep things moving. So please forgive me if I interject at some point. So I'm going to move now to these China questions, not necessarily in perfect order. I'm trying to keep some kind of coherence here. So here's one that I find quite interesting. The question is originally under the U.S., one of the motivations for CPTPP arguably was to make sure that the U.S.'s geopolitical influence in the region was on the wax instead of being on the wane and kind of pushing back against a rising China. Interestingly, that teleology, if you will, that was behind the original TPP is now different because the U.S. is not part of the agreement. But Japan is, right? And from my personal experience, they are certainly one of the most influential members. And so I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about what the geopolitical lens through which Japan views a possible China accession would be. I mean, clearly their posture on China is different, right? Their economies are much more intertwined, but on the security side, there's a lot of divergence. So I'm kind of wondering, in a scenario where we're envisaging China joining the CPTPP or starting talks, do you think that Japan would welcome that with open arms, or would they actually try to, maybe put a veto on that?
I think the Japanese would be very accepting of China's accession. Japan and China are both members of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So the kind of more Asian-based trade agreement. Now, that, as I understand it, that trade agreement is the rules for that trade agreement are less strict than CPTPP. But if the Japan sees itself, capable of joining with China in a more permissive trade agreement, certainly I think joining with China in a more restrictive trade agreement will even be easier for the Japanese to swallow, right? I mean, if there's more rules around what China can do, that might give Japan more confidence. So, I mean, we've seen, again, Japan participating in the RCEP, and then I don't think that they would stand in the way. I mean, of course, there could be significant liberalization of the Chinese service sector in CPTPP, and the Japanese would be extremely well placed to take advantage of those market opportunities.
Okay, well, that's a great answer. I suspect that it might be interesting to have a conversation with some Japanese officials, if only to underscore the potential upsides, because I've heard some murmurs to the contrary. But maybe again, it's that security, geopolitical equation that sometimes comes into, I think, into opposition to the pure economic logic of liberalization and expanding the tent. So I think that that's something that's kind of happening in real time, but certainly something to
well, I mean,
look at.
that absolutely is what's at play here, Philippe. And again, coming back to what Mark and I are trying to do is the importance of keeping a focus on the economic side of things. And the size of markets in Asia, Indo-Pacific generally, and Mark mentioned the services sector in China. I mean, the potential there for economic growth and prosperity is tremendous. And so we have this geopolitical security issue at the moment that's very much at the forefront, but the need to keep a very sharp focus on the economic side as well, and the benefits of that.
Yeah, that's a very noble aim, and that's why we're so happy to be able to host this event today and get that message out. Here's another interesting question. Do you think that China's demonstrated eagerness to join the CPTPP is actually a stall tactic to both prevent Taiwan from joining and also to stymie the CPTPP's progress, kind of throw sand in the gears, if you will, while China continues to exert influence via other economic and regional mechanisms such as RCEP and other similar initiatives?
I think China is very serious about joining. I don't think it's any type of stall tactic. I think that China feels very much at risk from the current situation and the unilateral approach of many countries. I think it looks for protection under the CPTPP, that type of protection that it's not currently getting under the WTO. So I think it's definitely real. China is the world's biggest trader. You know, they have a lot to gain by clear trade rules that everybody follows.
Yeah, and again, coming back to an earlier point I made, Philippe, I don't think we should underestimate the economic challenges that China is facing.
Absolutely.
And I have to believe that they, to Mark's point, as a large international trading nation, believes that international integration and involvement is part of what their future holds in terms of growth and prosperity, that they've got some huge structural adjustments ahead of them.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I mean, personally, I think one should never underestimate the resilience of the Chinese economy, and there's a whole kind of suite of policy options available to China if it was interested in engaging in them, that would kind of oxygenate that economy over the medium and long term. So I think I'm quite bullish on the long-term prospects, but there's no doubt that in the short term, the headwinds are strong, and even if the regime,
but wait a minute,
they have no choice but to focus on economic reforms in order to make sure that they're legitimately.
I think my point is exactly the opposite of what you just said. I think they have many tools to be able to buffer their economy in the short term, but it's the longer term issues that they really need to think about from a structural point of view, whether it's demographics, whether it's increased productivity, whether it's increasing domestic demand. I mean, these are all issues that are going to require very serious policy consideration. And I think being part of the global economy is part of that solution. So I wouldn't, anyways, I think short term, yes, they have many capabilities, but it's some of these longer term structural issues that I think are really important.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a sense of urgency in the short term. There's a need to address these issues, but I think there's also perhaps the political will to take a look at that as well. Although sometimes the way China's articulating its priorities still leaves one a little bit befuddled in terms of where the real priorities lie. In fact, if I can just add a quick little plug for us, we did a talk, about 80 or 90-minute talk on the Chinese economy and the challenges it's facing just a few weeks ago. It's been well received. So anyone who interested in unpacking that aspect of our conversation today, I kind of invite you to go to our website and have a look. Okay, so we touched on this briefly earlier, but there's several questions here. I'm going to try to roll them all into one. And I guess basically the way to frame this is there's no doubt that a perfect adherence of China to the CPTPP would lead to benefits for not only China but for the broader membership and for the global economy. But does China really have the ability to adhere to these levels of ambition in the short term? Recent discourse in China has emphasized the importance of security issues when it comes to ensuring economic development. And is it realistic to believe that China is going to loosen control on data flows, on control of its SOEs, on allowing foreign participation in government procurement, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess there's a long list here, but basically the idea being that there's some of these standards that need to be reached that do require a certain loosening of control and a certain comfort with prioritizing economy over security. So is it, I know, Mark, you touched on this in your presentation, but is there an opportunity to elaborate a little bit more on that?
So yeah, I mean, it's going to take big changes in China for them to be able to perfectly adhere. I would say, first of all, China has a track record. It made huge changes to its economy to accede to the WTO. I mean, before China acceded to the WTO, it was very much more a statist economy than it was after accession. You know, only certain companies could import and export, for example. I mean, many different things that they did. I mean, huge structural changes, which were probably bigger than the ones that they're asked to do now. In terms of the ones they're asked to do now, you know, you mentioned SOEs. So it's always been China's contention that they want the SOEs to compete on a level playing field with private enterprise in China. You know, whether or not that's actually the case, whether or not the playing field is level, I guess reformers in China could see the CPTPP rules over SOEs as a way to make sure that these level playing field is indeed level. With respect to data, again, China right now has a very different data regime from other countries, but it did actually already start in one of its special economic zones to loosen controls over source code. So, I mean, I think that China doesn't want to apply to accede to the CPTPP and fail. It wants to succeed. It would be a huge loss of face to show you can't do it. So I believe that they will try their best to do it. Of course, there could be hiccups along the way, but that's why you have a dispute settlement mechanism, right? That if people find that they're not adhering, it's transparent. So the point is, let's start the discussions. Let's see how far they can go. Let's hold them to their word.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to recall that, wasn't that long ago that Canada was trying to explore the possibility of beginning talks for an FTA with China. That got derailed by some other, very difficult political issues. But that's a great point. Okay, here's a couple of interesting questions that kind of two sides of the same coin. Do you think it's politically feasible for Canada to try to begin negotiations for China's accession to CPTPP amid the atmosphere of foreign interference in Ottawa? And that's question number one. Question number two, getting at the same thing, but from a different angle. The domestic political polarization in the US, Canada, and other Western nations drives a populist strategy of labeling China as a common enemy. How do you get political support for a strategy that wants to include China in globalization?
Yeah, these are good questions, but I think going back to the quote I mentioned from Janet Yellen, where there's an acknowledgement that the relationship between China and the United States is really one of the consequential ones for our generation. And it's my sense that when you peel that back a little bit, that you are in fact finding considerate views changing with regard to China. That does not in any way diminish the seriousness of the challenge, but I think there is a growing awareness that the global economy has changed, and we need to face it in terms of the realities that exist, not the way we wish it would be. And so it's an element of trust, building mutual respect for that movement to happen. But I think the building blocks are there, and I think from Mark's point of view and my point of view that the CPTPP does offer a very good and critical vehicle to help move that forward. So yes, it does require a change of thinking, but one that I think is quite doable.
Thanks. That's a very considered answer. I think it's worth everyone take note of how there are positive perspectives we can adopt in terms of addressing some of these challenges. Since you mentioned, Paul, you mentioned Janet Yellen. Here's a question that kind of follows up on that. You may have anticipated this one. How do we deal with the poison pill of CUSMA 3210? So CUSMA, the U.S., the Canada-U.S. Mexico trade agreement, and its 3210 article, which in effect, prevents non-market economies from being engaged with. So how do you deal with the poison pill of CUSMA Article 3210, where in effect both Canada and Mexico agreed to U.S. conditions preventing either country from entering into any form of FTA with China? This would surely include Chinese membership in the CPTPP.
Well, I think we're getting into a level of detail that takes me well beyond my level of expertise.
Send it over to Mark.
Yeah, maybe Mark has a view, but I mean that is the type of thinking that has to change. And anyways, Mark, maybe you've got something more positive or concrete to say about that.
Right. Well, I would say again, the vision that Paul and I have is that the U.S. also joins, right? Because we want to get everybody under the same umbrella. So in that world, they don't activate the clause because after reading Paul and I's the paper that Paul and I wrote, U.S. policymakers see the light and they say, yes, of course, it's not security, it's economic growth we need. Let's join this agreement. So in our view, this clause is never triggered. Now, Canada doesn't actually have a list of countries that are non-market economies. Neither does Mexico. The U.S. is the only country that has a list of what it calls non-market economies. And I don't know how it comes to that conclusion, who is market and who is non-market. And let me just say this poison pill clause, all the parties to the Canada, US, Mexico free trade agreement, all of them retain the right to leave at any time, with or without any kind of poison pill. All of them just can leave at any time. So, what we're arguing for is that, the US should also understand the benefits of global integration. And, perhaps after the US election, when the fires cool down, maybe, cooler heads will prevail and they'll come to that. But that would never be triggered, right? Because they think that, yes, it's better to get China under common rules. It's better that we also join to get the benefits. This is definitely the way forward.
Yeah, I think we'd expand a lot more on 3210 and whether it actually has legal force, but we'll leave that for another day. So look, there's a lot of questions here on the politics. I'm gonna combine two more together, and then I think we're gonna pivot to just a couple of closing questions that are more, again, back more on the systemic side of things, right? Sorry, bear with me here as I try to kind of join two questions together. Okay, so the first one is a little bit edgier, right? So do we not want to prevent Russia and Iran from being able to benefit from links to CPTPP states? So that's question number one. And question number two, also on the political side, perhaps the other side of the ledger, under a Trump administration, should not Canada be doubling down on expanding CPTPP in order to, ensure ourselves against an unpredictable U.S. instead of continuing to criticize China's global trade record? So again, I'm trying to, put contrasting questions together for your consideration.
Yeah, I guess on the second part, with the election coming up, and again, I'm no political scientist, and the government of Canada is, and rightly so, taking further concerted effort in terms of Team Canada going down to the United States and continuing to work our contacts there, and that's correct, and recognizes the potential risks from that point of view going forward. But I think the point to make is that the Indo-Pacific market is the growing market for the next number of decades. And when you think of the CPTPP as a next generation trade agreement that has a very business focus to it, again, from a macro point of view, we have a real productivity issue. We have a growth issue in Canada, and so we need to be part of these types of agreements to promote our domestic economic goals. So I don't think it's an either or. I don't think we have to look at the U.S. At the exclusion of the CPTPP, nor vice versa. I think the Indo-Pacific market, from a macroeconomic point of view, just offers so much benefit to Canada that we need to be part of that. That is the game that's at play right now, and we need to be there.
I agree. I think it's very helpful, Paul, for you to help frame these things. I think sometimes there's a need. There can be legitimate concerns about China or about the U.S. In many ways, but
of course,
we need to move beyond these kind of facile, kind of Manichaean dichotomies that seem to be taking hold in the public discourse, whether everything is black or white, and a little bit more nuance. And as you both mentioned very eloquently, the need to keep an eye on the big picture and on the aggregate benefits that can flow not only to Canada, but also to all members of these trade agreements, assuming that they're of higher quality and enhance global growth. Maybe we can end with one question or two. We'll see if something compelling rolls in. But this one, back on the more kind of nuts and bolts of the CPTPP, we're talking about the TPP, and we kind of, it's definitely a more modern agreement than WTO, for example. But it is already 10 years old. The world is changing fast. Are there any updates or changes that we should envisage in order to really make this agreement kind of like reflect the current nature of international trade? I mean, there's a lot of trends that were anticipated under TPP, but that have now really gathered velocity, whether it's in terms of e-commerce or AI or data flows or other aspects of the modern global economy.
Again, I'm going to be a bit apologetic for not being as expert in the details of all these trade agreements, but my sense would be, Philippe, that the one of the really critical areas is in the digital trade side. Let me call it the non-tangible parts of our growing economy, and the CPTPP, and Mark can talk to this as well, is trying to move the yardsticks forward and significantly forward. And I think that is an area that is going to only increase in importance. So to me, that's an area that we, as chair, can continue to help develop. But that would be the one area that I would highlight.
Mark, any thoughts?
I would just say that from my perspective, broad accession is a more important goal right now than fine-tuning the agreement. Okay,
great. Well, I think we can, maybe we'll end it here. I think we've managed to cover a fair amount of ground. Hopefully this has been stimulating for the viewers. And I'd like to, say thanks so much to both of you, not only for helping us, keep an eye on the fact that we shouldn't lose sight of economic growth as a global good, as a public good, as a driver of development. These days, a lot of the politics get batted back and forth, but sometimes we lose sight of the economic benefits that can accrue from a pragmatic approach to things, clear-eyed but pragmatic approach to things. So I'd like to thank you both for that. I think it's also it behooves Canada as chair to be creative and show initiative in terms of trying to drive some of these things forward. We have shown the ability as a country in the past to do that, both on the human security side and on the trade policy side. We can be an impactful middle power. So personally, as moderator, I'm not going to put out any prescriptions, but I certainly feel strongly that your call to action and your energetic plea to remind everyone that we actually are in the chairship right now and have an opportunity to do exactly that is one that is most welcome. So at the end of the day, I take good note of your energetic plea for China to begin negotiations as soon as possible. And I guess it might be a long road, but certainly worth considering whether, as you suggest, Mark, we should take the first step. A journey of 10,000 li starts with one step. 千里之行，始于足下. So it's not because you start walking that you can't stop talking as well, right? So I take good note of that, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with both of you in the future. And again, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Cheerio, everyone.
Bye-bye.